Good morning. Are you still having fun? Are you sure? Can you believe we're about halfway through the program? Yeah, I know. So today, also let's welcome our middle school students over here. Yes. And we have two visiting teams from Mexico today, one race car team and one cogworks team. Would you stand up from team from Mexico? Let's welcome them. They will be here for next 2 weeks, and next week we have two additional teams coming from Mexico. So 2 additional race car teams. Race car team, you better get going, okay? So today we have a really fascinating talk by Professor Neil Gershenfeld. He is the director of MIT's Center for Atoms and Bits and Atoms. If you ever did you ever wonder, like, how can you make anything? Well, today's your lucky day, and he's going to tell us all about that.
Okay, hi.
Let's give him a...
So this is a lab that I run at MIT, and these are some of the projects we did. We made the first significant computer that used quantum mechanics to compute faster than a classical computer. And we were part of creating the first synthetic living organism, where you design life in a computer and you output it to a cell, and you wake up a cell you designed in the computer. And we were part of inventing what's called the Internet of Things, of the internet and everyday devices. So that's the kind of research we do. And then these are the kinds of people. Do any of you use Twitter or Facebook? So my students built all the computers. One of my students, Rafi, built all the computers at Twitter. And one of my students, Jason, built all the computers at Facebook, coming out of the kind of work we do here. And at heart, to do that, it's because this is a quote from me saying, computer science, who's interested in computer science? So I said, computer science is one of the worst things ever to happen to computers or to science. And that's because it violates physics. So if you go back to Jason or Rafi, they can't believe in software. They have to take $1 billion and 10 megawatts, the power that runs a city, and turn it into information. And so you can't believe software is separate from hardware. They really have to look at how physics makes information. Now, to understand the background for how I came to do what I'm doing and how it might relate to you and in the future, when I was in high school, I wasn't a very good student. And in fact, I really wanted to go to the vocational school. I didn't want to be in a classroom. I wanted to go to the vocational school where you would learn to weld and fix cars and do things like that. And I was told, no, you're smart. You have to sit in a room. And nobody could tell me why I couldn't go to vocational school. But at heart, what's been emerging is, in fact, a real science of making things. So this is a picture from 1952. And it's when MIT invented connecting a computer to a machine to make something. So who's interested in 3D printing? Again, all the hands. This is where it started. This is the moment when, for the first time, a computer was connected to a machine to manufacture something, very close to here in 1952. Now, if you want to follow the history, about 2 blocks that way is a building, and this is a computer that filled the building. It was the first computer that could respond in real time. Rather than running as a batch, you could give it a job and you would get the result right away. That MIT then transistorized that, and that was this computer, and that was done at Lincoln Labs. And then that became a commercial product called the PDP. And believe it or not, this picture is one of the most important pictures for you in your whole life. This is two people at Bell Labs using the computer spun off from MIT, Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. And what they're doing is inventing Unix. They're inventing the operating system of modern computers. So it's quite likely you have a phone in your pocket and you do things on your phone. What's happening in that picture is how that all works. They're inventing modern operating systems. So video games, email, word processing, all of that happened in this moment. It doesn't yet fit in your pocket. It fills a room. But here they are inventing really modern computing. So now, to relate it to what I do now, my lab at MIT has the descendants of that first MIT machine. So we have almost every kind of machine to make anything. It's an unusual lab. So we can place individual atoms up to things the size of a building. And we have all the tools to measure them and make them. And that's what we use to do the research I showed you. But I had a problem. Once I assembled a lab with all of those machines, it would take a lifetime of classes to learn to use all the machines. So I started a class called How to Make Almost Anything. And it was just aimed at a few research students. But every time I teach it, it looks like this room. It's full of people who just want to come make stuff. And they do the most amazing things. So the first year, Kelly was one of the students. And she wasn't an engineer. She was an artist. She didn't have a technical background. And they do projects with all the stuff they learn. And so here's her project.
Hi, I'm Kelly. And this is my screen body. Do you ever find yourself in a situation where you really have to scream, but you can't because you're at work, or you're in a classroom, or you're watching your children, or you're in any number of situations where it's just not permitted? Well, Scream Body is a portable space for screaming. When a user screams into Scream Body, their scream is silenced. But it is also recorded for later release, where, when, and how the user chooses.
And go into the main building, up to the second floor. 저는 그냥 바로
So this is a web browser for parrots that lets parrots surf the internet. This is an alarm clock you wrestle with to prove that you're awake. This is a dress that defends your personal space if somebody comes too close. And these happened year after year in this class until I finally got that the student, I was asking how to do digital fabrication, how digital data becomes an object, but I wasn't really asking why. And the students were showing why. They were showing that the killer app for digital fabrication is personal fabrication. It's not products for a mass market, it's products for a market of one. It's you. And so to go back to the history, MIT spun off digital. Digital created the computers that created the internet. And in fact, 2 days ago, I co-hosted a meeting with all of the founders of the internet who came back to MIT on the 50th anniversary. Outside MIT, outside Boston, was this company that was the leading computer company of its day. Here's the founder, and he famously said, there's no reason to have a computer at home. There's a little background to that, but he said that. So when the personal computer came, they failed. The whole industry failed because they couldn't understand what it meant for computing to become personal. And what's really going on in this class is it's showing that manufacturing, rather than being something done by companies, is going to become personal. And so inspired by that analogy, I did a project for the National Science Foundation. So my lab has millions of dollars of tools, but there's a subset of them that you need to do the class. It's about $100,000 today. And so we put that together as a kit you could send in the field. So this is what's called a fab lab. It's about $100,000. It includes the 3D printer, but the 3D printer just makes a small piece of plastic. You can't make furniture or electronics with a 3D printer, but this includes all the other tools you need to make complete functional systems. And in fact, this is an interesting location. Have you ever seen a picture of a town in Iceland being destroyed by lava from an erupting volcano? Well, if you search for one, you'll find a picture, and that's this town. It's a little island in Iceland that was destroyed by a volcano, but then they rebuilt it, and this is one of many sites in the world I'll tell you about where these labs spread. So with those tools, these were all made in fab labs. You can make custom skateboards, kayaks, boats. Somebody made a whole house. This is a citywide data network. This is a computer terminal, health sensor, a robot chessboard, a boombox, production tooling. All of this is made not just with a 3D printer, but with the 3D printer and all of these other machines that together let you make things. And here's the crazy thing that happened. We opened one of these in Boston, and then somebody else wanted one in Ghana, then somebody else wanted one in South Africa, and they spread all over the world. So the labs we started here have gone as far north as you can go in Europe, as far south as you can go, the southern and northernmost cities on Earth, rural India, Africa, all of them have those very same tools. There's a thing called Moore's law, which is the growth of computing. And this is a plot of the logarithm. And by taking the logarithm, it means if something is doubling, it becomes a straight line on the plot. And so digital computing has scaled for 50 years, and now this is a plot of these fab labs, and they've been scaling just like digital computing. So we're in the middle of a revolution, but now it's not computing, it's a revolution going from digital to physical. And so here's what some of them look like. This is one in inner city Detroit, where you might hear about bankruptcy in Detroit, but they're buying up parts of Detroit and making it sustainable. This is one in Alaska, where there's great Alaska Native cultural traditions, but a lot of social and economic problems, and they're mixing traditional Alaskan craft with modern technology. Earlier this year, I was at the southernmost city on Earth. This is the furthest you can go. Right after that is Antarctica, and great natural resources, but it's impossible to get anything in and out there. So we set up a lab there so they can produce things locally. This is one at the boundary between Protestant Catholics in Northern Ireland, where they've been fighting for many years, but they can come together and work in the lab. Same thing, this is one in Israel in a mixed community. This is an amazing place. This is the Prime Minister of Bhutan, a tiny country between India and China. And Bhutan's economy is not based on money, the gross domestic product. It's based on what they call the gross national happiness. And it doesn't mean they're all happy, but it means they don't measure how much money the country produced. They measured, are people healthy? Are they happy? What's the well-being? The whole country is based on measuring well-being, but they couldn't make anything. And so we're setting up a lab there to make gross national happiness physical. So to keep up with all of that, in rural African villages and shanty towns, we had bright, inventive kids, probably much like all of you, coming out of the woodwork to these labs. And there wasn't a place for them to go. So we started a thing called the Fab Academy, which is like the classes I teach at MIT, but now they're distributed. So rather than you come to MIT or you look online, there's a global campus of local classes. So the students are in labs with machines and mentors and peers locally, and then we connect that all with video and content sharing. So one of these labs is outside Barcelona in the hills. Here's Guillaume. He wanted food. So at the beginning, all he could do was make a sketch of an aquaponic system. And so that was his technical skills. Then he learns CAD, so he can model the system. Then he's learning to use a laser cutter to make a small model. Then he's learning to use a large format mill to make a big model. Then he's learning to do the instrumentation for it. And then around here, he's learning to design circuit boards and make circuit boards and program embedded computer processors. So here's his Arduino, if you've ever heard of an Arduino. Here's his Arduino. all made in the lab. And now he's learning to attach and program the components. And then I love this picture. Here's his lettuce made on the system. And so this wasn't a class project. It wasn't a thesis. It wasn't a business. It wasn't a team. It was just him learning to use all of those skills to make a complete aquaponic system that can grow food. That spun off a project to do the same thing for K through 12 education, to do the same kind of maker education in schools, but meet teacher tests that's growing. And we've had to spun off a foundation to support all of this. And then one of the really interesting things is the political impact. So this is Barcelona's mayor. Barcelona is a wonderful city in Spain with amazing design sense, but they have over 50% youth unemployment. It's a huge number, a whole generation there. Just the economy is failing them. And so what they started is a commitment to a 40-year countdown to the city producing what you consume. So if you live in the city, in the same way the city has electricity or clean water, they're providing the tools that let you make things as part of the infrastructure of the city to produce what you consume. So that was in Spain. This was a lab we ran at the White House with President Obama. And just this week, a really interesting bill was introduced in Congress, a US version of what Spain is doing.
I'm United States Congressman Bill Foster, and I'm one of the few members of the United States House of Representatives who was a scientist before entering politics. So I often tell people that I represent about 1/3 of the strategic reserve of physicists in Congress. But when I came into work each day in physics, my first stop often wasn't to my office computer or some meeting, but to the laboratory machine shop to check on the progress of some parts that I designed for an experiment or for part of an accelerator. So I believe I can safely say that I'm the only member of the United States Congress that knows how to program numerically controlled machine tools. I'm proud to announce that I recently introduced legislation in the United States House of Representatives which supports the goals and mission of the National Fab Lab Network as in the best interests of our people and the best interests of promoting the goals of greater science and technical education, greater access to research and production tools, and empowerment of individuals to understand and use technology to improve their lives. You can think of the NFLN as a new kind of national lab in the United States that's a cloud laboratory, a national network of connected local labs. I've been lucky to have the chance to visit Neil and see.
So this is a bill in Congress for universal access to digital fabrication in the US. So if this talk is interesting, you can go back to your teachers or friends or family and point to this legislation and say, we should have this in our community to extend it. Once a year, all these labs meet. Next week, I'm going to Egypt, that's hosting the world, and this travels around the world. The year after that, all these labs are meeting in Canada, and the year after that, the country of Bhutan is going to host the world to do this. Now, let's look at the scaling. So there was one Whirlwind, this giant computer I said, and there was one of these machines at MIT. Then there were thousands of mini computers, and to understand the number 1,000, that's how many cities there are on Earth. And right now, there's a few thousand of these fab labs. After the mini computer came the Altair. Have any of you heard of the Altair? Ah, somebody has. Have you heard of Apple computer? Have you heard of Microsoft? Okay, both of them got started on this. So Bill Gates started a company called Micro-Soft to program the Altair. And the Homebrew Computer Club that became Apple came when the Altair appeared to work around it. And so even though you've never heard of it, this computer inspired all of the computer companies you have heard of. And so in the same way, what we've been looking at is not how you can go to a lab like I showed you and make something, but how the lab can make the lab itself. So these are two of my students, and for example, they wanted a whole fabrication facility they could take as luggage on an airplane. And so they made this machine that fits as carry-on luggage, and you open it, and it has an interchangeable system. And so in this case, it's a 3D printer. And so they'll start printing, but you can change the heads. And there could be a milling machine to cut or a knife cutter to cut and fold. And it has all the different tools in the lab that go on this modular carry-on luggage machine. And so that inspired many companies. All of these are companies, you might have heard of some of them, like Formlabs, that were started by our students to make companies that sell machines that make things. And so these are the things that you would buy if you wanted to be able to do what I'm describing. But the real interest isn't that. The real interest isn't a company that makes the machine for you to make something. It's for you to make the machine. So here's my work of my student, Jake. And you start by thinking, what kind of machine do I want? Is it big or small or straight or curved or stiff or fast? And so you design the parts of the machine. Then you figure out how they come together. And then once you've done that, it makes cut files to go into the machine. Then this is a really unusual machine architecture. It's like a little internet. The machine is a real-time data network in hardware. And then you make a software graph of what you want the machine to do. And the software graph talks to the hardware. And so in this case, we were at a wonderful arts retreat in Maine. And they wanted to plot clay to make pottery. So we modified the machine with a head that can plot clay. We added a few nodes that let you design a plot. And then this becomes a clay plotting machine to make your pottery. But then what's interesting is you don't have to just do that. The same parts can make many different machines. So this is a large format cutting machine. This is a drawing machine. This is a machine to play music. And they're all made out of the same parts, just combined in different ways. And so the idea is not rapid prototyping, learning to use a 3D printer. It's actually learning to make a machine to make something. And you can make many different machines. So now, in the history of computing, there were millions of these hobbyist computers, and now we're up to billions of personal computers. This is now the era of smartphones and tablets and all of that. And that's roughly how many people there are on Earth. And there we have a problem. So you could go into a fab lab like I showed you and make anything, but this thing you can't see is the inventory. Those are all the parts we have to send to the fab lab. This is a blow up of just one part of it. These are the electronic components. So you can make anything, but you need all of this inventory. And so that's not how you work. So you're made out of amino acids. Have you heard of amino acids? Good. So they're probably much more interesting than you realize. They're exactly like molecular Lego. They snap together like Lego. And with these 20 parts, you can make almost anything. So this funny-looking thing is a walker, and that's how your muscles move. This is how you smell. This is how you think. And this is the most interesting thing you can make out of those. This is a molecular factory that makes these parts. And so with those 20 molecular building blocks, you can create all of life, just 20 parts. And so that led us to ask, why can't we do technology that way? So we made an environment where if you want to make electronics, instead of placing components, you place micro building blocks. And then, let me go back to show you. This is the size of a Lego brick. And then this is scaling down. And you can't see that scale bar, but that scale bar is measured in nanometers. A nanometer is 10 atoms. So this is like a Lego brick, but it's getting down to the size of individual atoms that you can snap together. And so you can snap them together to make electronics, and then you send them to an assembler that assembles that. And so instead of a printer extruding plastic, you're assembling these micro blocks to make functional material. That idea has grown. The idea is digital materials, materials where you code the construction. So we did the same thing on a bigger scale. So here's a robot to construct, where it takes bigger parts, it walks on the parts, and snaps them together. And it knows where it is by just counting the steps on these pieces. And then in a minute, you'll see something that was very exciting for us. So now it can climb up. And once it can climb up, it can keep climbing, and a little robot can keep building a structure as big as you want. And so once the little robot can make the big structure, we've then used that to make, you can't quite read that probably, but that's 25 feet across. This is the size of one of NASA's biggest wind tunnels. And we've used these parts to make airplanes that can flap their wings and change shape. Not by making the airplane the way it's done today with a big tool, but by assembling these little building blocks that let you make big things out of them. So finally, we're in now what's called the Internet of Things era, where all the devices around you, like thermostats and the chair you're sitting on and your clothing, all get connected to the internet. And that's leading up to 1 trillion things on the internet. What's interesting about this history is if you take a smart thermostat, it has about exactly the same power as the mini computer. So we went from 1 to 1, and that has the same power as the whirlwind. So we went from one of these to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 to 1 trillion, but they all have the same power. So for fabrication, now we have a problem. This is how many things you place, and then this is how fast you place them. This is all of modern manufacturing, and this is biology way over here. So we can't place the parts fast enough. So the biology solution is brilliant. The ribosome, the assembler that makes you, is slow. It assembles molecules. A molecule is tiny. It assembles 1 a second. So think about that. You're made by assembling 1 molecule a second. So it would take a long time to make you 1 molecule a second. But the trick is a ribosome can make a ribosome. So you start with 1 of them, and then that makes 2 of them, that makes 4 of them, and that makes 8 of them, and you end up with millions of ribosomes. And so even though any one of them is going really slowly, together they're placing millions of parts a second. And so the heart of this is the assembler can make itself out of the parts that it's assembling. And so the most basic project we're doing is to make an assembler that can assemble itself from the parts that it's assembling, a self-assembler. And so what we're up to in that project is, here's a really interesting machine. Instead of a printer, what it does is it takes these little tiny building blocks, and what it's doing right now is making a robot. But it's not making a robot the traditional way. It's taking the micro parts that go into the robot and assembling them to make the robot. And so once it's done, what it just made is this. It made a little walking robot. And then the idea is with that little walking robot, ensembles, so just a little robot can climb up walls and hang off of things. But then these little robots, we're now programming for them to make more of the robots, just like the biological version. And so it's an assembler making parts of assemblers to make more assemblers. So to do this, we have to make a really unusual tool that you're probably learning to use CAD to design things and probably learning to write programs. But here we have to smush them together. So this is a tool that lets you design a program that communicates how to construct itself. Because if it's an assembler assembling an assembler, it has to be programmed to tell sort of the child that it made how to make itself. So you have to merge computing and communication and fabrication in one tool. Now, interestingly, let's see, how many of you heard of John von Neumann? Some of you. So he invented modern computing. brilliant person. He's really one of the main architects of computers as you understand it today. And the last thing he studied was exactly what I showed you, how an automaton can communicate its own construction. How you can have a program that tells something else how to make itself. And so that was theory. We can make it now. And then how many of you have heard of Alan Turing? Good, more of you. So he's really created the ideas underlying modern computing. But what you probably weren't taught was the last thing he studied in his life was called morphogenesis. And so I'm going to tell you what that is. Both von Neumann and Turing, who are known for computing, ended their lives by studying manufacturing, studying how digital data becomes physical. And so morphogenesis is how you were made. You have a genome, and the genome became you. And how it does it is really beautiful. Your genome doesn't store that you have 5 fingers. Nowhere in your genome is the number 5. Your genes run a program, and the program does things like break symmetry or climb gradients. It has a whole bunch of operations like that. And when you run that program, you end up with 5 fingers. So this is a day in the life of a zebrafish. There's the egg, there's 1 cell. Then after that, there's 2 cells. Then there's 4 cells. Then there's 8 cells. And then they keep doubling, and then they start breaking the symmetry. And at the end of the day, you have the zebrafish. And again, the genome doesn't store the plan of the zebrafish. There isn't a CAD file. There's a procedure you follow that makes the zebrafish. And so this is done for a beautiful reason. If you just randomly change things in your genome, it would either be fatal or inconsequential. It would be hard to change the genome in an interesting way. But by rearranging these developmental programs, you can do interesting things, like go from walking to swimming or fingers to flippers. And so it's very similar to how machine learning works. Your genes do a kind of machine learning that stores the representation of life. And so we've been doing a really interesting project to learn how to do that for engineering. And so one of the first things we wanted to do was rediscover gears, which are surprisingly subtle. And so this is a morphogenesis, a kind of machine learning. And what it's doing is it's talking to a physics simulation, and it's trying to learn how to make a gear. And initially, they don't really work, and they're funny shapes. But it keeps evolving. And eventually, it discovers how to make them mesh. And that was just a very first step in this project. What this is moving towards is the technology means you can design something with 1 billion parts in it. And that's too hard for you to do in a CAD environment. And so we're moving towards, instead of you designing something, you figure out what you want it to do, and then you collaborate with a computer that evolves a solution to what you're asking for it to do. And so design itself becomes a collaboration between you and machines. And ultimately, you can think about all of this as this way. I've advised a number of movies in Hollywood. This was an interesting one on the movie The Martian. Have any of you seen that? So the bonus material for the movie The Martian is me with a group of very interesting people explaining how you create life on Mars. And what I'm showing here is you don't need the industrial revolution on Mars. You don't need all the factories and all the inventory. What you need to do, essentially, is to create life in non-living parts in just the way I've been describing. Getting at this profound question is, how do you bootstrap a civilization? What are the minimum building blocks for a technological civilization to survive? And so that's bonus material in the movie The Martian. And so in this book, I talk about all of this. My older brother ran the National Labor Relations Organization, and my younger brother, let's see, how many of you play video games? So he ran the biggest video game studio at Activision. He developed and ran the biggest video game studio. And then he got tired of games where you shoot things and blow people up. So now he runs a video game studio for education and social change. They work with Alaska Native to do traditional storytelling in video games. And they're just releasing an amazing game with the BBC where you go into oceans and you learn to talk to whales and do things like that. And so this is a book about this digital fabrication revolution. And so if we go back to this graph, we're 10 years into a revolution of going from digital to physical. And if you look at this history, computing went from 1 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 to 1,000,000,000,000, and that's happened. Going from digital to physical is following the same course, and we're right about here. And so learning to hack a 3D printer is just the tip of a much bigger story. Today, beyond 3D printing are many other processes. Then comes not learning to hack the printer, but make the printer. Then goes from just printing a piece of plastic to assembling functional systems, and ultimately self-assembling systems. So we're right in the middle of that history. Now, when I show you this picture about Unix being invented, you can react, those are old guys, that's a long time ago. But this completely dominates what's happened in your life ever since. This is you now, that this history projects decades in the future, but it's being invented right now. So you're the people in this picture figuring out if anybody can make anything, how do you live, learn, work, and play? That's not old history, that's a future being invented, and you're right at that point. So with that, I'll thank you and take questions. Yep. So there are a number of organizations we spun off to help with that. To be clear, all labs that fabricate aren't fab labs, just like all computers aren't part of the internet. What the Fab Labs has created is this network of labs that's more powerful than any one of them. And so there's a portal, FabLabs.io, that tracks them, where you sign up to be a Fab Lab. And there's a Fab Foundation that works with donors and funders and provides logistics and support to organize them. And so these organizations are a starting point to do that. And again, the point of becoming a Fab Lab as part of this network, one is what's in them isn't static, but it evolves with this best practice. So people and projects are shared across them. And then on top of the Fab Lab network, it builds the programs I described, like the Fab Academy, and there's business ones and things like that. But start at FabLabs.io and Fab Foundation. Did my brother make? Oh, let's see, at Activision, there were so many of them. He did the games that did like Mech Warriors. He did spy games. Just look at Activision. I don't play video games. I like writing the things that let you make video games. I don't play them. Just look at Activision, and you see a lot of them. But what you should really ask is not the games he made. You should ask the games he's making. You should ask what he did after making. So he made all these billion-dollar giant market video games, but now he's making games where you don't just shoot things, but the games help you and help the world. Yeah? Louder? Well, so you understand that question. You're at MIT's campus. A few years back, somebody added up all of the businesses that got started here. And the economic output from all of those businesses falls between the economic output of Russia and India. So MIT equals Russia and India. And so it's trillions of dollars. But let me caution you. So there are a lot of people here who made money. But let me caution you. Billionaires aren't happier than anybody else. Once you have $1 billion, it sounds cool. The way Bill Gates says it is same hamburger. In the end, he eats the same hamburger. If you go back to Bhutan, once you have the $1 billion, that still doesn't really make you happy. Projects like the one in Bhutan or Barcelona are getting at not how you simply have a lot of zeros in your bank account, but how you enjoy your life. And I wouldn't make them equal. The bill? So the question is the chances of passing the bill. What's interesting about it is it's very, very bipartisan. So in the House, the co-sponsor is Bill Foster, the remaining scientist in the House, the most liberal member. And the other co-sponsor is the most conservative member in the House. Thomas Massey wrote a bill that was one sentence. It said, "The Department of Education is abolished." And it didn't get passed, but that shows you how conservative he is. But they completely agree on this. So it's very bipartisan, so the chances are good. But to a surprising extent, it doesn't even matter that much, because just the existence of the bill has already helped release funding. So like Chevron committed $10 million against it, even though it's not yet passed, as a commitment towards it. And so just the fact that these bipartisan groups came together to write the legislation is already very helpful. But we're hopeful because we're going to be doing, in about a month, an event at Congress on it. We're hopeful because it's so bipartisan. It's one of the few things where all the parts of the country agree.
So in a world where anyone can build whatever they want, whenever they want, where does that leave startups and other businesses?
Yeah, so this is exactly open source hardware. So proprietary software failed. Microsoft has basically given up. Microsoft is almost an open source company. There's a surprising merging of open source in Windows that used to be the most extreme opponent to it. Open source won for software because it's faster, better, cheaper, scales, all sorts of benefits to it. But open source doesn't mean free. So in fact, Microsoft is making its money now not by closed source Windows, but by running Azure data centers that you run the Windows on, for example. There's all sorts of businesses based around software being freely available, but you make the money from how you add value with it. So in the same sense, open source hardware means you don't try to hide the design of this as a proprietary design. You can make a business making this. You could make a business customizing this. But a lot of the businesses in the Fab Labs sell not the thing you made, but the benefits of making. They create regional infrastructure. They replace supply chains. They educate. They reduce conflict. They improve the environment. And so there's all sorts of business models around this idea of open source hardware. And so intellectual property is really subtle in that when I invent a robot to make jumbo jets, I patent that. But for a patent to be useful, you have to be able to identify infringement, and you have to be able to enforce infringement. And that doesn't apply to anything you could do in a Fab Lab. And so things in Fab Labs, the patents don't help you. You make it open, but you build business models on how you create value on top of it. And it's very different from the traditional startup model. Let's see, why don't we go here?
Is it free to use Fab Labs, or do you have to pay the?
All of the above. So meaning the Fab Labs that succeed are a mix of, there's some free time for the community, there's some time funded out of philanthropy, there's some more specialized time for members, there's time for classes, there's time working with little businesses, there's starting businesses, there's time with big businesses. It's very heterogeneous. It's a little bit like the range of different uses of a library, but it's heterogeneous. It's not a single thing. Yep.
Education. And my question is, the students who are learning there, how can they use what they're doing in the Fab Lab and what they're learning in the Fab Lab for like real-world applications of their own?
So what's interesting about that question is when these labs started to spread to literally shanty towns or Arctic villages, my first reaction was, my goodness, is this what you need right now? Aren't there more immediate needs? And there were two really strong reactions back. The first one is, that's not up to me. It's not up to me to decide should they have that. That's up to them. But the second one is, in remote Arctic villages and African shantytowns are kids that look exactly like all of you, bright, engaged, curious. And so Africa largely skipped landline phones and went right to mobile. And much of Africa is skipping paper money and going right to digital money. They're way ahead of us on those. In the same sense, anywhere we open the Fab Labs, there are immediate needs like hunger or sanitation or conflict, but there are other needs like curiosity, discover, art, play, connecting with the world. And over and over and over, the conclusion is if you were growing up in one of those locations, you don't want to wait a lifetime to transform the economy of your country. You want to get right to art and play and discovery and all of that. And so the kids in those villages, they're working on immediate needs, but among the most immediate needs are not immediate needs. So we have these labs in refugee camps. And there can be horrible conditions for these refugees, but they're stuck without entertainment or education or entrepreneurial opportunity. And so these are among the most important needs to meet right away rather than waiting a long time for it. Yeah.
So you made the comparison between biological amino acids and machines. Elaborate on what the machine version of an amino acid is.
Sure. So what I showed quickly are what we call digital materials. And so to understand the distinction, compare your Lego bricks to a state-of-the-art 3D printer. One difference is your 3D printer has a build volume. The Lego bricks don't, because you can start locally and you can keep building. And the difference is the 3D printer, the geometry comes from the motion system. In the Lego bricks, the geometry actually comes from the bricks themselves. So that's one difference. The second difference is, have you ever used a 3D printer and have the print fail and you get a tangled mess? That doesn't happen with the Lego bricks because when you assemble the Lego brick, you can detect and correct errors. So the Lego tower is more accurate than your child. Have you ever had a 3D print that was a fail, then you then had to throw it away? The Lego bricks don't make trash because they contain enough information to disassemble them. And so those properties of global geometry from local constraints, you can detect and correct errors, you can join Lego bricks made from dissimilar materials, and you can unbuild them. Those are exactly the properties of amino acids. And further, those are the properties of digital codes. And so underlying what I described is this idea of having building blocks that are like code. So let me explain a picture. So have any of you ever used a telephone? OK. So this is Vannevar Bush at MIT making the last great analog computer. It was a room full of gears and pulleys. And the longer it ran, the worse the answer was. And his student was Claude Shannon. And Claude Shannon was so annoyed by that, he invented information theory. So modern telephones came from a student working on this project and getting annoyed because you couldn't error correct. And so the heart of what he introduced was code, states that let you detect and correct errors. And so what amino acids are doing is if you mix chemicals, you can get a yield of maybe a part in 100. The ribosome makes an error of 1 in 10 to the 4 by error correction. DNA replication makes an error in 1 in 10 to the 8 by adding extra error correction. And that's what we're doing to make the machines I showed you. We're putting codes in construction that let you detect and correct errors and turn codes into objects. Okay. Let's see. Yeah.
So you're a digital industry that you described. Do you think that would be more or less effective than the analog industry we have now? And how will digital evolve in the industry in its exponential nature dealing with the finite resources of the
Yes, so just operationally in the work I'm describing, we've started many new little companies working in this space that have been succeeding. One of my students created a company worth $1 billion now, as an example. And we've also worked with companies like Nike or Philips, who are going to be around in 50 years and really worry about the sustainability and how they fit in. There are a bunch of companies in between that'll become obsolete because in the world I'm describing, you hear a lot today about like tariffs and inequality and countries fighting. But in a world like this, you can ship data, but then produce locally. And it really changes the relationship at heart of how an economy functions. And so it's going to blow up a lot of existing business, just like the computer industry around Boston failed when PCs came. At heart, for your question about sustainability, that shows up here in a couple really profound ways. The first one is instead of today you need jobs to have money, to have work, to buy things, you can produce it locally. It's not free, it's not utopia, but you get rid of that whole global supply chain. And so in the short term, we work very hard in Fab Labs about using sustainable materials. But the deeper answer comes to his question. Once you switch from printing and cutting to assembling and disassembling, trash goes away. There's no trash in a forest. Trash is an analog concept. It means you can't take it apart and reuse it again. And the processes we're using are fundamentally reversible for the life cycle of the materials. So you have to be careful about the scaling question. How many of you have used an inkjet printer? Okay, so there's a funny story about that. Inkjet printing was largely driven by Hewlett-Packard, but the inkjet business, HP is in Palo Alto in California, but the inkjet business is in Corvallis, Oregon. And it's in Corvallis, Oregon because they had to hide from their managers. Because there are a group of people that said, we could make a printer that would produce beautiful pages. The printer would be cheap. The only problem is it wouldn't be very fast. And the manager said, that doesn't scale. That's not useful. They wanted to know how many pages per minute. And so the inkjet division hid in the calculator division to invent inkjet printing. But the point is, the inkjet printer on your desk, you don't want it to mass produce. Every page you print is different. So you have an inkjet printer on your desk. In an office, you might have a laser printer. In a building like this, in the basement, you'll have a workgroup printer. And then in the city like this, you'll have a roll-to-roll web printer. The web printer goes faster, but that only makes sense if everybody wants exactly the same thing. There's a hierarchy of that capacity. So in the same sense, all those inkjet printers, each doing a page slowly, if there's enough of them, adds up to the capacity of one central printer. And so what I've described doesn't replace central manufacturing if you really do need to mass produce, but you mass produce the boring things that are the same for everyone. Local production makes sense if what you want are things that are different, and if they reflect you and they reflect your community. So it's not one versus the other, it's a hierarchy. And it's very similar to the hierarchy in computing. You can have a computer in your watch, then a computer in your pocket, then a computer on the desktop, and then a computer in the cloud. And they don't replace each other, but it's a hierarchy of capacity. Why don't we go back this way? Yeah.
In the case of like universal access to Fab Labs, would you worry about the destructive potential access?
Worry about what?
Like the destructive potential.
Yeah, so we've worked with groups like the FBI or Homeland Security and all the scary things you can do with this. I don't worry about that here. I do worry about that in other places. I'll tell you about. The reason I don't worry about it is hurting people is a well-met market need. If you go stand on a street corner in Boston and say, I want to buy a gun, and if you say it for 5 minutes, I'm sure somebody would come by who would sell you a gun. And the Fab Lab gun you produce is a terrible gun. It's just not a very good gun. And in fact, you don't even need that. You can go to a hardware store and buy some parts, and you can throw together a gun, and people have been doing that for years. And so making weapons has been happening long before Fab Labs, and they're all over the place. What we find is when we have these in war zones where people are literally shooting at each other, they don't come to the Fab Lab largely to hurt people because you don't need the Fab Lab for that. They come to it for everything else. But there's a shading to that, which is we do have kids who come to the lab and say, I want to make a mech warrior suit because there's somebody I want to fight. And what happens is the lab helps coach them, helps explain, well, you can make the mech warrior suit, but here's how it might hurt you, and here's why you might not want to hurt that person, and here's some other people who you might want to spend time with, and helps pull them out and connect them with the community. And that role of the community is one of the really important things. Your question is much more serious around, you can use a fab lab to make a biolab, and with the biolab, you can make bioweapons. And that's really scary, that's really serious. And there's no way to control it, but what's emerging, the answer there is the same one. You can't prevent people from doing that, but you can give them incentives to not do it by themselves in a basement, but do it in a community, do it with light rather than in the dark. We're almost out of time. Let's see, no, you already asked one, sorry. Let's see, let's do one from each section, they'll be done. So back there. So I described this in two levels. One was a kind of analogy. I'm making these micro building blocks that are inorganic that make assemblers. But the literal one, my lab was part of a much bigger collaboration of a number of institutions called JCVI and NIST, where your cells have a genome, and a cell can make another cell. And what's possible today is you can design a whole genome from scratch in a computer, and then you can synthesize that genome and put it in a cell and boot up a living thing with a molecule designed in the computer. And there's a lot you can read about that if you search for that. There's a step after that we're working on is what I described needs the cell to boot it up. We're now working on how you can actually make the other parts of the cell also in the computer. But it's like digital design, but you're designing with the molecular building blocks in the genome that completely describes a living system. So it's a beautiful design problem. So let's see, one more in the middle. Sorry, louder.
Oh, sorry. So you mentioned that you're working with a lot of different people from different disciplines like biology or manufacturing. So how do you communicate with some people who might not speak the same language like science?
Yeah, I think the best answer is the academic program I'm associated with was started by a wonderful person, a former president of MIT, Jerry Wiesner, who wanted to create a department for people who didn't fit in departments. And so the work I'm describing is less very interdisciplinary of one of each person in a team. It's people themselves who don't fit in disciplines. So the people doing this work master a wide range of disciplines around this idea of digital and physical. You have to work very hard to do that. You have to know a lot about a lot of things. But there are people who come to an environment like this to not be bound by any one subject or any one discipline. So one more from this side. Yeah. Yeah.
So the micro building blocks you mentioned, they're inorganic. Is it possible to use other substances like organic materials or nano?
So in what I described, we're doing both. We're using the organic building blocks when we're actually building with them, but the organic parts aren't good for very high temperatures or very high electron mobility or high magnetic fields. And so there's a limit to the material properties of the organic ones, which is why we're doing it with the inorganic ones. Okay? So wrapping up, if you search for my name in this book, you'll find some talks. This book is a much longer version of this if you're interested. And then the most immediate thing is this legislation to create a national fab lab network was just submitted. You could take this as a homework assignment. If you go to congress.gov, you can search for legislation. And if you search for National Fab Lab Network Act, you'll find out about this as an immediate follow-up. And let me end by saying you did a really good job with questions. They were good questions, and you leapt into them. So thank you.